The old farmer found a woman in the forest, took her home, and days later she couldn't... A fateful meeting. The farmer Richard was going about daily activities, taking care of his animals and looking after the fields and apple trees. A whole forest of apple trees promised a good harvest. Even though he did not own many animals, he was satisfied with the small farm, which gave him a reliable livelihood. He was used to hard work and toiled from sunrise to sunset. He could not earn wealth with his lifestyle, but he had enough to eat, lived in an old cozy house, and was in tune with the world around him. The daily routine on the farm and the change of seasons defined his life. One sunny day, Richard heard a loud bang from the nearby road, and he curiously walked over through his rows of apple trees to the nearby forest. He saw a car parked by the road that had been in an accident, but there was no driver anywhere in sight. Then, a little further away, he saw a young girl lying on a forest path. She was barely clothed. Her clothes still lay scattered with burn marks along her way from the car to the current rest location. The girl did not regain consciousness, but was breathing noticeably and was not outwardly injured. Richard carried the girl into his home and laid her on a bed. He talked to her, but she did not respond. There was also no response when Richard dabbed her face with water. He realized that he had to call for medical help quickly. The ambulance arrived quite soon after his phone call and made a frightening discovery on the way. The young girl's car had caught fire and was ablaze. The flames also hit the apple orchard after the tank exploded, which suffered losses until the fire department arrived and extinguished the fire in the apple orchard and the car. Meanwhile, the paramedics took care of the young girl. She had hit her head very hard and therefore had to go to the hospital because of a suspected traumatic brain injury. Even while the paramedics were present, she didn't regain consciousness. There were no papers, no clues as to who she might be. Since the car got burnt, the young woman's cell phone was also left in the vehicle, and nothing was left. No ID, no documents, and no clothes. The paramedics praised Richard for saving a life. However, Richard was still sad and upset. Now, who will pay me for my damages to the apple trees? I planted this apple orchard just a few years ago and was looking forward to the first harvest, and now a big part of it is burned. Embarrassed, the paramedics stared at Richard, then stared at the girl in their ambulance and the humble surroundings on the old farm. Since no one knew if there was an insurance to cover the damage, no one could ease his worries. The hospital. The girl was taken by ambulance to a hospital. After many medical examinations, they connected her to various monitoring devices and waited for her to regain consciousness. But there was no sign of any consciousness. She was in a deep coma. Richard came to the hospital room daily, bringing flowers and sitting by her bedside. He sometimes took her hand and spoke to her, but there was no response. Meanwhile, the police had been searching for her identity, but no one was reported missing or inquiring about her. The explosion of the vehicle had also affected the license plate, and now they began to search the owner of the car using the portion of the license number that was still visible. One day, the girl began to move when Richard was back at the sickbed. She squeezed his hand. Her eyelids trembled, and she opened her eyes for the first time again. Richard called the doctors, and there was a sigh of relief from the nurses, who were all involved emotionally in the case. The next day, the girl was discharged because, according to the examination, she was healthy and had no after effects from the severe accident, except for amnesia. She needed to figure out where to go without money, ID, or cell phone. Richard offered to take her to his house because each day in the hospital would also cost more money. Since the girl had nothing, this was a big problem for everyone involved. The girl could only remember that her name was Paula. That was all she knew. She was relieved that she could go to Richard's farm for now, and the doctor promised to notify her as soon as police had any new information. She could no longer occupy a bed at the hospital because she had recovered except for the memory loss. The nurses were kind enough to donate a few pieces of clothing so she would not have to leave without changing clothes. She packed the few items in a small backpack and walked behind Richard to his car. The old vehicle for carrying loads for the farm frightened her, but she braved it, as she had no other choice. Richard also told her not to worry since her car had been burned out in the accident was an expensive BMW. Her family had to be very rich, thus they would be found soon. Arriving at the farm, he showed her a room with a simple bed. The kitchen in the house seemed small and practical to her, but very modest. She wanted to check social media to see if anyone was missing her and if there was a strange missing person case. But Richard had no internet or TV, so there was no possibility of looking at social media channels. Paula cried in despair. Then she ran out to Richard, who was already back at work. He just said she could make herself useful there and had plenty of time. She could feed the pigs and harvest the fresh vegetables so that he would not have to do everything alone. A little hesitantly, she started the work, but with time she even enjoyed it. There were fresh peppers, carrots, tomatoes, and wonderfully fragrant herbs to harvest. Richard took a crossword puzzle when they had eaten dinner and sat in an old armchair. Paula asked him if he had always lived like this, alone on the farm. Richard answered reluctantly that he used to live here with his family. He had a wife and a little daughter. But the modest life on the farm was not enough for his wife. She was lonely here and would rather see more of the world. One day she gave him divorce papers and packed a suitcase for herself and the little girl, and they moved to this city and from there to another city. After a few changes of residence, Richard could no longer locate her. His wife had made arrangements so that it was impossible to contact them. To look into it properly, Richard could have been more satisfied. He could not offer his wife more than the simple life in the country, and she blamed him daily. She said his daughter should have a better life and cut off all contact with him. He's yet to hear from them again. When Paula was stuck with him, he was overwhelmed by the memory. His little girl was also named Paula. Paula was very touched and now understood why Richard had come to the hospital every day, brought her flowers, and offered her a roof over her head. She reminded him of his lost daughter. Now a feeling of gratitude came over her despite the sore muscles from working on the farm and the worn clothes the nurses had given her. It was reconciled to her that she thought that she had been led by fate to his door and that her presence was significant to him. But the story was to become even more mystical. Unbearable noise in the front door. At night, exhausted from the day's work, the two fell asleep in their soft beds. Until there was a sudden noise outside the door. There was a rough and rumbling knock on the front door. Richard grabbed his old shotgun and was about to open the door carefully when it was broken wide open. A special police squad rushed into the house, disarmed him, and pinned him face down against the wall. "She's here!" yelled an officer. Paula jumped out of bed in her skirt, startled. They'd been looking for her and asking around about her name. Immediately after, a clamor and arguing could be heard, as it could only come from one person. Richard knew that voice. "You kidnapped her, and you want revenge on me!" Richard's ex-wife made her voice heard until the officers slowed her down. Paula was questioned, and even now the amnesia was slowly giving way. Finally, she began to realize what had happened. Her mother criticized her for leaving their apartment after an argument with her head over her heels and wanting to look for her father despite her mother's prohibition. Paula was driving her car around where she knew she had been born. She went off the road on a curve because her cell phone was ringing and her mother was still angrily scolding her on the loudspeaker. The break from her life of luxury, modeling around the world since she was 15, cost her mother a lot of money as her manager. Contract penalties and deals that she lost meant a substantial financial loss. She had hired a private detective to track down the daughter and had finally been successful. Nothing now stood in the way of Paula's return to her model life. Nevertheless, Paula was glad that she had found Richard. The police had to leave once they had taken the story of the accident. Paula promised her father Richard that she would revisit him and replant the apple trees together. She had found her roots, and fate led her purposely to her old home. Do you believe in providence in Paula's journey? And if you also have a mysterious story to tell, please let me know in the comments.